The Marriage Fix. Billionaire Games, Book 3. Written by Sandra Edwards. Narrated by Randy Fuller. Chapter 1. Hang Ten was located on the coast between Santa Monica and Malibu, about a mile from Lacey de Laurent's inherited California home. From the front, the restaurant looked like an old warehouse that had been constructed out of salvaged wood from ships that had seen better days. The roof was tin, the windows single pane. It didn't look like the kind of establishment you'd typically find in Southern California, but the parking lot was always full. There were two entryways. The one on the left opened up to a bar that showcased hot bands playing hip music. The second door led into an open-deck restaurant, and beyond it, a beachside dining patio overlooking the Pacific. Lacey de Laurent and her friend, Deidre Ferguson, had discovered the place 3 weeks ago, shortly after arriving in Southern California. While the food, music, and ambiance were all splendid, there was another benefit to constant visits to the establishment. Hang Ten's owner, Nick Matthews, was drop-dead gorgeous and on the verge of getting married. Literally. But there was no harm in looking, and Nick was fun to look at. Chestnut brown hair, sun-kissed with golden highlights, brown eyes the color of chocolate, a smile that dented his cheeks with dimples, and a trim, athletic body were enough to keep Lacey occupied for hours. On this Friday evening in the bar, there seemed to be an unofficial party going on for Nick and his fiancée, Jenny, who were getting married tomorrow. They sat at the bar, surrounded by their friends. Drinks and high spirits were flowing. Nick looked happy, and Jenny, well, she was just there, donning a faceless expression. Lacey couldn't tell if Jenny was happy or excited or just plain bored. Maybe she was nervous. "See how she looks?" a woman in the booth behind Lacey said to her companion. "She looks inconvenienced. That's not right for a woman who's marrying a guy like Nick Matthews tomorrow. Hell, I'd be loving life right about now." There was truth in what the woman was saying. Something about Jenny's demeanor was off for a bride on the eve of her wedding. "I thought she'd be happier," Lacey said to Deidre, sitting across the booth from her. "Who?" Deidre's brow furrowed. "Jenny?" Deidre glanced over her shoulder and lingered that way for a while before turning back to Lacey. "You going to stop coming here now, after tomorrow?" "What's tomorrow have to do with anything?" "Well, he will be married." Deidre shrugged and grabbed her drink. "It just doesn't seem right, drooling over a married man." "My brother's a married man," Lacey said with a tight jaw. Deidre's lingering crush on Lacey's brother, Andre, was no secret to anyone. And even though Andre had been happily married long enough to have a 2-year-old son, that hadn't stopped Deidre from pining away for him. "Point taken." Deidre laughed a little and sucked her drink up through her straw. In the past year, Deidre had lost a little weight, gotten a new hairstyle with some colorful blonde streaks over auburn highlights, and traded in those awful wireframe glasses she used to wear for contacts. The new look had given Deidre a confidence that she'd always lacked. Lacey and Deidre had left Deidre's grandmother's house in Florida about a month ago, with their sights set on California. Lacey hadn't told Papa she was leaving Florida to go to California. His daughter alone in America, without a chaperone? As Camille and Tasha would say, Papa would hit the roof. Lacey's American sisters-in-law had taught her plenty of American slang, and she was glad of it. While her accent would identify her as foreign, she didn't want to stand out as a complete oaf. So far, Lacey and Deidre were enjoying their independence, and neither would be ready to leave California anytime soon. The display lit up on Lacey's phone, which was lying on the table. She glanced at it. "Papa." By now, surely he knew that she and Deidre were no longer at Deidre's grandmother's house in Florida. He'd know where she'd gone, and he wouldn't be happy. Lacey hit the ignore button and pushed the phone aside. She would have to answer to Papa sooner or later, but not tonight. "Your father again?" Deidre asked. Lacey nodded.
If you keep ignoring him, we're going to wake up one morning very soon with one or both of your brothers knocking on the door." Nick Matthews gazed into his fiancée's gray eyes. She gave him a smile that he knew was forced. Maybe it was the crowd. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she was just on edge about tomorrow. Jenny had a habit of worrying about anything and everything that could go wrong. He stroked her silky dark hair back out of her face and rested his hand on her shoulder. "You want to go?" he asked. She nodded. "Everything okay?" he added, just to make sure. She nodded again and pushed her soft drink away. Jenny wasn't much of a drinker, and she had little tolerance for those who did. "I should get some rest. Don't want dark circles under my eyes tomorrow." She gave him a slight smile, but he knew it wasn't genuine because it never made its way to her eyes. They remained empty, bored. Or maybe she was just tired, or simply didn't like being around all the people drinking. "So I guess you're set on this spending tonight apart thing." Nick chuckled when he said it, even though he wasn't feeling a whole lot of amusement. Jenny nodded. Yes, I am." "Come on, Jen." Nick turned on the charm, which seemed to work on every woman but Jenny these days. Still, he tried. "I've been staying at the hotel across the street to please you all week. I want to come home, to my wife." Nick didn't get why he couldn't come to the house this past week. Her excuse, she didn't want to jinx the wedding, was plausible enough, but since when had they adhered to tradition? They'd been living together for 2 years. It wasn't like the wedding night was going to be something new for either of them. "I won't be your wife until tomorrow," she said in a firm, no-nonsense voice. When she got like that, she was unshakable. "Okay." Nick's heart thudded dully in his chest. If they weren't getting married tomorrow, Nick might start to feel like Jenny was avoiding him. "Let me talk to Dean," he said. "Then I'll drive you home." Jenny shook her head. "I'll take my car." Her glance darted away from him. Before he could utter a single word of the counter-argument coming together in his head, she said, "Otherwise, I'll have no way to get to the church tomorrow. You can't see me before I walk down that aisle." The seriousness in her tone squelched Nick's desire to laugh. It wouldn't pay to piss off his fiancée the night before the wedding. "Can I at least walk you outside?" he asked, half offended at her determination to remain apart from him. "I'd like that," she cooed. Nick stood, reached for her hand, and looked at the bartender. "Pete, if you see Dean, let him know I'll be right back." "Will do." Pete didn't miss a beat as he continued mixing drinks. Holding on to Jenny's hand, Nick led her through the bar toward the exit. "I wonder where Dean went." "Knowing Dean, you might find him in the parking lot with some girl." She giggled, an odd response from Jenny when the subject of Dean Triplett came up. Dean was Nick's best friend and the director of the Kevin Matthews Community Center, a local hangout for kids, for which Hang Ten was a key benefactor. Jenny could stomach Dean as Nick's best friend, but Nick's affiliation with the community center, not so much. About 6 months ago, Jenny had suggested that Hang Ten break its affiliation with the community center, that there were better things they could be doing with $5,000 a month, but Nick had been adamant about his support of the community center that bore his brother's name. Without Hang Ten, the center would likely close within a few months. Nick couldn't let that happen. Outside, Nick leaned in to kiss Jenny, but she turned her head, presenting her cheek. Confusion muddled his head, but he kissed the spot she offered. Jenny had been doing some odd things lately, like kicking him out of the house because she wanted them to have a traditional wedding night. This shouldn't surprise him. But the thing was, there was nothing traditional about cutting out the sex a week before the wedding. "You sure everything's okay?" He studied her face, as if it'd provide some kind of clue. It didn't. "Perfect." "I'll see you tomorrow, then?" Suddenly he wanted to hear her confirm it. "Be on time," she said, and got in her car.
Nick lingered outside long enough to watch her leave. Then he went back inside to find Dean. He'd been awfully quiet the past couple of days. Nick wanted to know why. A quick check back in the bar, but no sign of Dean. Nick did notice and nodded at the cute little blonde and her measurably less attractive friend as his gaze rolled past their table. They'd been coming in a lot during the last couple of weeks, and he'd figured them for new to town or on vacation. The blonde was definitely Nick's type, even more so than his fiancée, which still boggled his mind. Girls with dark hair rarely caught his eye, but Jenny had, and now he was 100% committed to her. That didn't mean he couldn't appreciate an attractive woman, though, and this one was. Next stop in his search for his missing best friend, Nick sought out Carrie, one of Hang Ten's hostesses. He found her in the outdoor patio dining area and asked, "You seen Dean around?" "I think I saw him go into your office." She pointed back toward the interior of the building and then took off. His office. That's the one place Nick hadn't looked, although he should have. Dean was prone to using his office to make phone calls, and that was okay with Nick. The restaurant and bar were usually too noisy. Nick found Dean inside his office, sitting behind the desk with his cell phone pressed to his ear. Nick dropped to the couch against the wall to the left of the door and waited for Dean to finish his call. Dean looked at Nick, nodded, then said into his cell phone, "Yeah, okay, I'll see you tomorrow." He listened a few more seconds before disconnecting the call. Dean looked at Nick, saying in a half-hearted tone, "This economy is killing us." He deposited his cell phone into his jacket pocket and shook his head. "Man, if not for you and Hang Ten, I don't know what the community center would do." "I'm just glad I can help. The kids need somewhere safe, recreational, and creative to hang out after school and on weekends." Nick leaned forward, clasping his hands between his legs. "As long as Hang Ten is profitable, we will help." "I really do appreciate that." Dean lowered his head. "What is it?" Dean lifted his gaze but kept his head low. "Well, I don't like to play that card, especially with you." "Dean," Nick shook his head, "you know I'll help the center any way I can. I've already given you 11 grand this month. 6,000 more than Hang Ten's usual monthly donation to keep the center up and running." "Well, that's just it." Dean had a subtle, uneasy inflection in his voice. "Ginny never gave me the 6,000 for the new computers." "What?" Nick had specifically asked her to do that a week ago, and she'd bitched about it for 2 days. Nick went to his desk and pulled a checkbook from the middle drawer. "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding." He reached for a pen and began scribbling out the details on the check. "She's been busy. Maybe she couriered it over and it got lost in the shuffle or something. Anyway," he handed Dean the check. "Here you go, bud. I'll ask her about it tomorrow." Chapter 2. Back at Lacey's place, a Spanish-styled hacienda overlooking the Pacific, the time was nearing midnight. Lacey and Deidre had headed home after Nick disappeared, and Lacey succumbed to the doldrums over his impending marriage. She didn't know why it was affecting her so profoundly. It wasn't like she and Nick had ever been close. Hell, they weren't even friends. She barely knew him. But since when had that ever mattered when it came to attraction? She dropped down onto the plush tan couch, her purse resting at her side, and propped her feet up on the maple coffee table. Staring at the massive stone fireplace in front of her, she wished it was cool enough to light a fire. At least that'd give her something to concentrate on. As it was, her mind was idle enough to dwell on Nick Matthews and his impending, scratch that, inevitable marriage to his supermodel gorgeous fiancée, Jenny something or other. Tomorrow. Deidre switched on the overhead light. An array of tiny light bulbs in the chandelier above Lacey illuminated the room with entirely too much light. Lacey groaned and shielded her eyes. The lights went out. Deidre shuffled to the other side of the room and switched on the small lamp sitting on the table against the wall behind Lacey. A soft glow illuminated the room. Much better. Lacey rested her head against the back of the couch and closed her eyes. The room began to spin. Bad idea. Opening her eyes, she lifted her head. God, what a depressing night! She could hear Deidre fiddling around at the bar behind her. Ice clicking against glasses, then liquid pouring. Good. That's exactly what she needed. Another drink. Lacey fully intended to drown her sorrows. Well, Deidre said, I hope you'll move on since Nick is practically a married man now. She moved around the couch and stood over Lacey, offering her one of the 2 glasses she carried. Here, drink this. After Lacey took one of the glasses, Deidre sat down beside her. Lacey sniffed the drink. Damn, water. She leaned toward the coffee table. Before Lacey could set the glass on the table, Deidre stopped her. You need to drink the water. Lacey cut Deidre what she hoped was a biting glare, then took a sip. Do you want to go home? Deidre asked. God, no. Lacey practically cringed. I'm not ready to go home. I'm having too much fun. Fun, huh? Lacey could feel Deidre's eyes boring into her. She just didn't get it. Worshipping Nick Matthews from afar was much more fun than being under Papa's controlling thumb any day. Her phone jingled a playful tune inside her purse. She fished it out and looked at the display. Papa. Again. She laid the phone on the couch, display up. Still ignoring your father? Deidre asked. Lacey shrugged. He only wants me to come home so he can ruin my life again. She sighed heavily. I'm not ready to go home. I need more time here in California, where I can be free to discover who I am. Her voice trailed off as she added, or who I can be. If you keep ignoring him, Deidre said in that all-knowing tone she was so famous for, we're going to get a visit from Julian and Andre. With only the table lamp on the desk casting a soft light over Nick's office, he paced the length of the open space with one hand on his hip and his cell in the other. The call at the other end rang out through his speakers, and rang, and rang, and rang. Eventually it went to voicemail, just like it had the other umpteen times he'd called. Nick wasn't in the habit of calling Jenny incessantly like this, but considering how she'd been acting lately, he just wanted to know that she'd made it home safely. At the sound of the tone to leave a message, he disconnected the call. He'd already left her a message, more than once. Various scenarios, none of them good, bounced through his head. Jenny on the side of the road with a flat tire. A breakdown. An accident. Nick shook the images out of his head. If any of those things had happened, she would have called by now. If she could. Nick hit the speed dial again. The door opened and Dean came in. Nick's call to Jenny went straight to voicemail. He disconnected the call and looked at Dean. She's not answering her phone. You're paranoid. Dean rolled his eyes. He stepped back and closed the door. Maybe, Nick shrugged. But there's got to be a reason why she's not answering her phone. I'm sure there is, Dean chuckled. She doesn't want to talk to you. She wouldn't blow me off. Nick shook his head. Something's wrong. She's a girl. It's the night before her wedding. She's doing that ritual thing they do, casting some sort of spell or something. Dean's laughter reached out and wrapped its mocking arms around Nick, making him feel a little bit ridiculous. Lighten up, man. Nick threw his hands up. Fine. He leaned against the desk and crossed his arms over his chest. Dean wasn't going to let up, but Nick had news for him. Neither was he. No way could he go to sleep tonight without knowing if Jenny was home, safe and sound. Nick's phone jingled. He glanced at the display. A text from Jenny. Nick tapped the screen. Home safely. Going to sleep now. See you tomorrow. Don't be late. He lifted his gaze to Dean's somber stare. It was Jenny. She's home. He felt a little stupid, but wanted very much to drive by the house just to make sure everything was okay. After a second or two, Dean started shaking his head. He pointed at Nick. I know that look. As soon as I leave, you'll be right behind me. Nick groaned and huffed. I just don't understand why I had to move out of the house this week. Jenny and I have been living together for over 2 years. I told you, Dean laughed. It's that ritual spell-casting thing that girls do right before they get married. His eyes widened as he shrugged and shuffled backward toward the door. Just deal with it. Tomorrow you'll be back in like Flynn. I don't know. Pressing his lips together, Nick looked away, down to the floor. Dude, she is absolutely going to kill you if you go over there tonight. Dean's face flared with augmented agitation. I've got to save you from yourself. We'll drop by your motel room and grab your tux. For what? You're coming with me to my house tonight, so I can make sure you don't do something stupid. Holding a tray with a pitcher of orange juice, 2 glasses, a plate of donuts, and 2 saucers, Lacey passed through the double doors leading out to the terrace. Orange juice sloshed in the pitcher, and each step she took was more cautious than the last. Carefully, she set the tray on the glass table and gave herself an imaginary pat on the back for not spilling it, before claiming a seat on the middle of the couch. Carrying trays decked with drinks and other liquids was not as easy as it looked. Lacey had a newfound respect for those who did it for a living. The morning sun cast its golden hue across the clear blue sky. Lacey stretched past the tray, reaching for her sunglasses on the far side of the table. Securing them in the crook of her finger, she dragged them toward her. Shielding her eyes behind the shades, she relaxed enough to enjoy the cool morning breeze blowing in from the ocean, bringing with it the scent of the honeysuckle lining the edge of the property. Lacey poured herself some orange juice and sat back, sipping it as she took in the view. Gosh, she said out loud, even though she was the only one there. Deidre, as far as she knew, was still sleeping, but Lacey had brought a glass out for her just in case she happened to wake uncharacteristically early today. Lacey gazed out at the ocean beyond the far side of her property. Calm and still, it melded together with the early morning blue sky. What a beautiful day! Too bad it was overshadowed by Nick's wedding. Oh, well. Lacey blew out a soft sigh and reached for a donut with her free hand. He was married now, practically. She needed to find a way to move on. Maybe I'll just stop hanging out at Hang 10, she kidded herself. While steering clear of Nick's restaurant was doable, although doubtful, Lacey had no plans to leave California anytime soon. Her cell phone vibrated on the breakfast tray. She leaned forward to glance at the display. Mama. Well, perhaps she should take her call. It was one thing to ignore Papa, but quite another with Mama. Lacey set her OJ on the table and picked up the phone, clicking on the call. Hello, Mama. Good morning. It's not too early there, is it? Mama's voice poured out from the speakers. No, Mama. I'm awake and up, enjoying a wonderful view of the Pacific Ocean. I guess I don't need to ask if you're having fun. There was no questioning in Mama's voice, just assumption. Instantly, Lacey had a desire to cry to her mother about Nick's wedding today, but that was a bad idea. Right now, Mama was the only thing standing between Papa and Lacey. Mama had taken a hands-off approach to Lacey's American adventure, even after she and Deidre left Mavis Ferguson's house in Florida without a word to anyone back in France. But this, crying over some guy who was getting married today, that was the kind of thing that had pushed Mama over the edge and onto Papa's side. Lacey wasn't strong enough to challenge both of them. We're having a wonderful time, Mama, Lacey said with conviction. And before you ask, yes, Deidre and I are being very careful about who we trust. Strangers. That had been Mama's main complaint. She was worried about something happening to Lacey and Deidre, but she, unlike Papa, realized that she could not cage Lacey up forever. She was, after all, 23 years old. Sooner or later, they had to let her live her own life, make her own mistakes. And that time was now, thanks to Lacey's brother's uncle, who had included her in his will. Sometimes Lacey forgot that Julian and Andre were only her half-brothers, and that Mama was not their mother. That Papa had had another wife before Mama. It didn't feel that way. Occasionally, Lacey even thought that Julian might be Mama's favorite. Most of the time, though, Mama treated them all equally, which made Lacey's inheritance from Edward Renault seem a bit surreal. "That's good, darling." Mama's gentle but sober voice brought Lacey back to the conversation. "I want you to have fun and see the world, but I also want you to be safe. I promise, Mama, we're not letting our guards down. I would feel better if we could send one of the valets over to help you out. I wouldn't feel right about taking Soren or Simon away from Julian and Andre." But she did understand her mother's point, and even agreed with it to an extent, at least the part about having someone else take care of the house. "I'll look for someone over here." "But it would still be a stranger, dear." Mama's voice filled with worry. "Soren's brother, Gerard, is available. What if we sent him over?" It wasn't really a question so much as a fact, and Lacey knew that. "I don't know, Mama." Her voice trailed off as she lost her confidence, right along with the ability to stand up to Mama. Lacey had to admit, though, if she was going to hire a butler, it would be nice to have someone already acquainted with the family. Still, she couldn't help but feel that this was a trap being set by Papa. "It would make me feel better," Mama said in that tone that always indicated the matter was settled. "And it might appease your father. You should know he does not like the fact that you are in America. He wants you to come home, one way or another." "So he wants me to come home?" Lacey laughed it off. "What's he going to do? He can't force me. I'm over 21. Papa couldn't do anything legally, and now, thanks to Uncle Edward, Papa had lost his final remaining hold on her, finances. "Sweetheart." Even with the one word, Mama's voice had become overrun with caution. "Never underestimate your father." Mama paused, and Lacey pictured her shaking her head. "Seriously, Mama, what's he going to do?" "And don't forget that you are in America on a visa, a temporary visa." Claudette stopped talking. The silence gave Lacey's head a chance to fill up with new and scary scenarios of Papa having her deported. Just when she was about to completely freak out, Mama said, "He will stop at nothing to get what he wants. You should be prepared for that." "Then you stop him, Mama." A newfound desperation fueled Lacey's words. She wasn't ready to go home, not yet. "Darling," Mama chuckled, "you have a lot to learn about men." Her voice had softened, but her words were as determined as ever. Mama also had a way of getting what she wanted. "Shall I send Gerard over?" Lacey hesitated, unable to fully contain her despair, before it escaped with a slight moan. Mama added, "Of course, De Laurent Enterprises will pay his salary." "No, no, no," Lacey objected. "I'll pay his salary. I want him loyal to me, not Papa." Chapter 3. Standing in front of the mirrored dresser, Nick fiddled with the bow tie. How he'd managed to stay at Dean's all night was a mystery. Truth be told, there were a couple of times when he'd seriously contemplated slipping out the back and driving by the house, just to be on the safe side, assure himself that everything was okay. Of course, Nick was being paranoid. He knew that, and comparing Jenny to his brother Kevin was stupid. Jenny was as straight-laced as they come. She didn't do drugs. Hell, she barely drank alcohol. Just getting her to agree to sip some champagne at the reception had been a chore. Even so, the feeling was there in his gut that something was wrong. That same feeling that had consumed him in the days before Kevin's death. It hadn't been a secret that Kevin Matthews, at the age of 17, had had a drug problem, heroin. It's what killed him. Nick had replayed that scenario over in his head millions of times in the 17 years since. If he'd only listened to his gut, could he have saved Kevin? But Nick was only 15 when his brother died, far too young to be mature enough to make a difference. But things were different now. Now he had Hang 10, which afforded him the opportunity to help the community he worked and lived in. That's where the Kevin Matthews Community Center came in. Nick, through Hang 10, was the benefactor for around 70% of their operating expenses. Dean was the center's director, so Nick knew his money was being put to good use. Even though Jenny wasn't, and never had been, thrilled about Nick's involvement with the center, this was one area where he refused to budge. If Kevin had had some place like the center to spend his free time, rather than the streets and getting mixed up with a bad crowd, maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't have succumbed to the dope. Nick's mission in life was to give the kids a safe haven so that his brother's death was not in vain. And that same gut feeling he'd had about Kevin was now eating him up about Jenny. Nick shook his head and yanked the tie away from his neck. The door opened, and Dean poked his head in. "Didn't you hear me knocking?" he asked. Nick huffed. "Sorry." Holding the tie dangling in the air, he tried, without much success, to laugh. Dean shuffled into the room and took the tie from Nick. "Here, let me give you a hand." Without waiting for an invitation from Nick, he went to work on the tie. "Don't tell me you're still worked up." It's my gut." Nick tugged at his collar, as if the tie was too tight. "It's telling me something's wrong." Dean slapped Nick's hand away. "You're getting married today. Nothing's wrong." Dean finished up with Nick's tie and turned him toward the mirror. "I think maybe deep down inside you feel guilty about being happy. Life goes on. Kevin would want you to enjoy it." Nick ignored Dean's 2 cents and inspected his handiwork with the tie instead. "Not bad," he said, tugging at the bow. "Let's go. You don't want to be late, right? Let's take a little detour on the way to the church." Dean studied Nick through squinted eyes. "Where did you have in mind?" "Let's just drive by the house and make sure everything's okay." A few seconds of Dean's obtrusive glare was all it took for Nick to rethink it. But just in case that wasn't enough, Dean said, "She's probably already left for the church, and if you're late, she's going to kill you." Nick pulled his cell off the dresser and set about texting Jenny. Granted, it was a good idea. Okay, better than a drive-by, because once she responded, he'd know she was okay, and she wouldn't be mad about him coming by in person. This traditional wedding idea had gotten a hold of Jenny about 6 months ago and turned her into a bridezilla. And now, on his wedding day, Nick didn't want to piss her off. If he did, he'd probably be the first groom in history to be cut off on his wedding night. Seconds later, a text dinged in. It was Jenny, replying, "See you at the church." Nick looked at Dean and smiled, waving the phone in the air. "She'll see me at the church." The text allowed him to breathe a little easier. Nick grabbed his jacket and followed Dean out of the room, determined to forget about that knot twisting tighter in his gut. Chapter 4. Marseille, France. The Mercedes limo cruised along the motorway while its passengers, Claudette and Maurice, rode in silence. Claudette peered at her reflection in the compact mirror. Not a single strand of her blonde hair was out of place. Granted, she'd taken to having the gray hair dyed out years ago. Her blue eyes still sparkled, and the wrinkles hadn't overtaken her face too terribly badly, thanks to all those expensive beauty treatments. She'd be 50 in a few years, but all in all, she still looked pretty good. Claudette cut her eyes toward her husband. 50 had come and gone for Maurice de Laurent, but he carried his age well. Of course, he'd put on a little weight over the years, but who hadn't? His jet-black hair had long since grayed, and sometimes his brown eyes looked tired, really tired. But he was still the handsomest man of her acquaintance.
"What exactly did she say?"
His question broke the silence.
"As I've told you before."
Claudette closed the compact and slipped it inside her purse.
"Lacey is not ready to come home. She's experiencing life on her own for the first time, and she's enjoying it."
"I don't like it," Maurice huffed and shook his head.
"Of course you don't like it," Claudette laughed. "You are not in charge."
"But I should be," he growled. "I am the head of this family."
"Just where did you get the idea that head means boss?"
He ignored her inquiry, saying,
"My children have no respect for my wishes."
"Your children love you, but they're adults."
Claudette pressed her lips together and looked at Maurice through narrowed eyes.
"You need to respect the fact that they're responsible for making their own decisions."
Maurice's head began shaking.
"No, we must not allow this to happen."
Claudette laughed.
"And just how are you going to stop it?"
She waited for the idea to take root inside his head.
"You can't cut her off. Thanks to you, she has her own money now, and plenty of it."
Claudette rarely missed an opportunity to remind her husband that while meddling in his youngest son, Andre's life, he'd inadvertently set up their only daughter with financial independence, separate and apart from the family.
"I can have her deported."
His eyes brightened.
"You can't have her deported."
"I could arrange it."
"You are not going to arrange her deportation,"
Claudette said, adopting a challenging tone.
"I have everything under control. I'm sending Soren's brother, Gerard, over to look out for her."
"Oh, that's a very good idea,"
Maurice said with a crisp nod.
"He can send us reports on her activities."
"No,"
Claudette's voice was soft, yet determined.
"We are not spying on our daughter. We are simply looking out for her welfare."
Claudette sucked in a breath, hoping it would calm the fluttery feeling in her chest. It didn't.
"I just don't want her to get hurt or taken advantage of."
"I want her back here, back home, where she belongs."
"Darling,"
Claudette's tone softened. When her husband got like this, there was no stopping him. This called for a newer, gentler approach.
"She'll come home when she's ready. Until then, all we can do is send Gerard over to make sure she's safe."
"Gerard will report back to us," Maurice said sternly. "If I hear one thing,"
his glare hardened as he raised his forefinger,
"just one, that I don't like, she will return home."
Maurice gave Claudette a dismissive nod.
"One way or another."
Okay. Claudette had tried reasoning with her husband. Deep down, she'd known it wouldn't do any good, but she had to try, so that in the end, she didn't end up blaming herself for her husband's meddling ways. She would talk to Julian to see if he had any ideas for discouraging his father. If Maurice pushed Lacey too far, Claudette knew she would end up retaliating in true de Laurent fashion. After all, she was her father's daughter. Maurice de Laurent didn't like being wrong. In fact, he loathed it. He didn't like it that he'd lost control of his daughter either. As long as she remained in America, his control would diminish daily. And though he wasn't willing to admit it, not openly anyway, he had precious little left. The door to his study sprang open. His 3-year-old granddaughter, Juliana, skipped across the room. Shoulder-length blonde curls bounced in perfect rhythm with her frolicking.
"Papi!"
she squealed, arms outstretched. Maurice's heart lit up like a Christmas tree.
"Juliana, how are you, my darling?"
He scooped her into his arms.
"Fine, puppy." She kissed his cheek. "How are you?"
she asked, with hints of an American accent, which Maurice found completely charming.
Lovely. He tapped the tip of her nose and gave her a smile. Tell me, what is your grandmama doing? He didn't doubt that Claudette had sent Juliana in to sway him from the temptation of sneaking a drink, while he thought everybody was too busy to notice. She's picking flowers. Of course she was. Claudette loved the roses, and if that preoccupied her while Maurice devised a plan to get Lacey home, so much the better. Juliana paused, a thoughtful look overcoming her face. Papi? Her blue eyes lifted up to look at him. Yes. He gave her a smile. When is Aunt Lacey coming home? Maurice's heart sank into his gut. Soon, my dear, soon. If Papi has anything to say about it. Maurice sat Juliana on the desk. That reminds me. He opened the top right drawer. Papi has something for you. Juliana clapped. He brought out a blue velvet jewelry box and opened it. I thought you'd like something pretty to wear when Aunt Lacey does come home. Juliana's eyes sparkled almost as much as the diamonds in the heart pendant hanging on the dainty gold chain. Pretty, Juliana whispered amidst a sigh. Maurice fixed the necklace around her neck and then helped her down. He stood and clasped her tiny hand in his. Let's go find your grandmama. He wanted to know when Gerard was to arrive in California. The sooner, the better. Chapter 5. Lacey and Deidre had dragged a couple of lawn chairs out to the hillside patio beyond the back lawn. It sat perched on a cliff, just a few steps down on a wooden walkway that twisted and turned and eventually made its way down to the Pacific. They'd pushed the patio furniture aside, as the lawn chairs were better suited to sunbathing, the girls' current activity. Deidre turned over onto her stomach and folded her hands under her chin. So, what happened when your mom called? Should we expect a visit from one or both of the brothers de Laurent? She capped off her inquiry with a hint of laughter. Bite your tongue. Lacey went up on her elbows. We're getting a valet. A valet? Yep. Valets help you dress. A guy's not helping me dress. Lacey shrugged. Well, actually, he's going to be more like a butler. A spy is more like it. No, I'm taking care of that. He's going to be employed by me, not Papa. Mm-hmm. Deidre's tone held as much certainty as Lacey's. No, I'm serious. Deidre blew out an exhaustive sigh. I can't believe you fell for that. Mama says that Papa wants to have me deported. Lacey let the fear clawing at her gut escape in her words. Can he do that? That's what I keep wondering. Well, if we've learned anything from your father's dealings with your brothers... Lacey cut her off. Then the only conclusion we can draw is that Papa is capable of doing anything to get what he wants. If you get deported... Deidre's words trailed off. If she got deported... Just thinking the words made Lacey shudder. Even though Nick Matthews was getting married in a matter of hours, she wasn't ready to go home. In the passenger seat of Dean's vintage Mustang, Nick fiddled with the strap of his seatbelt. If only he could have spoken to Jenny this morning, but she wasn't answering her phone. If not for her text message this morning urging him not to be late, he'd be a ball of nerves right now. Okay, who was he kidding? He was a ball of nerves. Nick looked out the car window. House after house and their well-manicured lawns streamed by. The redundancy lulled him into an almost hypnotic state. He was glad he wasn't driving. A knot had cemented in his gut and was getting heavier by the minute. When they arrived at the church, people were already milling around out front. Dean drove around to the back entrance, and Nick glanced at his watch. 2:30. The ceremony was in an hour. Surely Jenny was at the church by now. He glanced around the back lot, where 2 limos waited in the wings. He felt confident that one of them had brought Jenny to the church. Dean parked his car by the back door. As soon as he shifted into park, Nick unlatched his seatbelt and opened the car door. Dean cut the engine and was right behind Nick as he opened the door leading into the church.
"Now remember," Dean coached him, "don't go looking for Jenny. She'll have a cow if you see her before the wedding."
I know, Nick said, and headed into the small room where he'd been assigned to wait for his cue. Nick entered first. Dean followed and closed the door behind him.
"Man, you gotta lighten up."
Dean snorted out one of those condescending laughs of his.
"You couldn't get lucky enough for Jenny to leave you standing at the altar."
Dean didn't particularly like Jenny. That was no secret. Nick had hoped he'd ease up on her by now. No such luck. Nick shot Dean a hard glare. "I'm the lucky one." Dean's sharp laughter bellowed out. Once he'd contained it, he said,
"Hardly."
He shook his head.
"She knows a good thing when she sees it."
The look on his face said he was wondering if he'd said too much, overstepped his bounds. But as usual with Dean, the end result was always, "What the hell?" He gave a dismissive shrug, adding,
"She's going to show all right."
Well, once they were back from the honeymoon and everything had settled down, Dean would come around. Nick was sure of it. He looked Dean in the eye and asked,
"Would you go see if she's here?"
Dean sucked in a breath, held it a minute, and then blew it out in an exhaustive sigh.
"Okay, fine. I'll go confirm that she's here."
Dean slipped out into the hallway. First, he had to find out where they had stashed the bride. He shuddered. He tried to get behind this marriage. He knew his friend was in love. He just wasn't so sure the feeling was reciprocated. Oh, sure, Jenny put on a good act, but Dean got the feeling that she was more interested in the money Hang Ten made than the proprietor. Nick wasn't exactly rich, not by L.A. standards, but he did all right. The restaurant made him a good living and allowed him to keep the center going, which was Nick's top priority. Too bad it wasn't Jenny's. That woman intended to break the connection between the restaurant and the community center, and the fact that she'd forgotten to give him the check for the computers was all the evidence Dean needed. To his dismay, the girl would meet Nick at the altar today, with bells on, which meant it was the beginning of the end for the community center. Canvassing the maze that was the black corridors of the church, Dean finally found someone to point him in the right direction. He knew he'd found the place when he rounded a corner to see a whole slew of women loitering outside a set of double doors. Jenny's bridesmaids? What were they doing hanging out in the hallway? He took a survey of the girls, all wearing the same black dress. Who does a wedding in black? Wasn't that like the kiss of death?
"Ladies, why are we hanging out in the hallway?"
He asked no one in particular, but taking notice that the only women missing were Jenny and Eve, her maid of honor. Maybe they were inside having some kind of powwow or something. The bridesmaid closest to him said, "The door's locked." Her blonde hair had been perfectly coiffed. Part of it was up, and the rest lay in long curls around her shoulders. Normally, Dean was a brunette man, but this girl was pretty. Maybe he could steal her away during the reception in Hang Ten. It wouldn't be the first time he'd had a girl in Nick's office. Plus, it'd probably piss off Jenny. That made it even more appealing.
"Jenny and Eve must be having a serious conversation about something."
Dean hoped Eve was talking her out of going through with the wedding, but he doubted Nick would be that lucky.
"There's nobody in there."
The girl's frantic voice draped a veil of goosebumps over Dean.
"Seriously?"
Dean was about to turn all giddy until he realized that his best friend getting stood up at the altar wasn't exactly an act of kindness, at least not on the surface. But her not being here, it didn't make any sense. Jenny had found herself a decent ride with Nick, and Dean didn't see her letting go so easily, unless she found a bigger fish.
Chapter 6. Nick glanced at his watch. Dean had been gone a long time. He was only supposed to find out whether or not Jenny had arrived. How big could the church be? Just when he'd almost decided to take matters into his own hands and find out for himself that Jenny had arrived, the door swung open. Dean slipped into the room. The look on his face was anything but comforting. "What?" Nick asked. His heart thudded triple time inside his chest. This was bad. He knew it. Had there been an accident? Oh, God. She's just running late, right? "I don't know, man," Dean shrugged. "She's not here. She's not answering her cell or the phone at the house." He gave Nick one of those looks you give a friend when there's nothing good to tell. All kinds of things. Heavy traffic, a minor accident, the car broke down, a bad accident. Jenny had run out on him. Fought chaotically to be the dominant thought inside Nick's head. He shook out the last one. No way Jenny would run out on him. He kept coming back to the bad accident. Oh, God. "She's okay, right?" Nick's voice wavered. Dean's head started shaking before he said, "I don't know, man. I can't get in touch with her." "What about the limo service that picked her up to bring her here?" "I'm waiting for them to call me back." After a moment of silence and uncertainty, Nick said, "I should go to the house." "Let's just wait and see what the limo people say. Maybe they were late picking her up. You don't want to head over there if she's on her way here." The words came out of Dean's mouth, but he didn't look like he believed them. He looked like the kind of guy who was about to claim the right to say, "I told you so." "I just can't sit here and do nothing." Nick paced the center of the room, stopped, and looked at Dean. "Something's wrong. I can feel it. If she were able to call, she would." "Wouldn't she?" Dean's cell phone rang. He took it from his pocket and glanced at the display. "That's got to be them now," he said to Nick. He tapped on the screen, accepting the call, and raised the phone to his ear. He listened intently for what seemed like forever. Nick perched his hands on his hips. At this point, the only thing he'd gotten out of the conversation was a few groans and a headshake or two on Dean's part. Nick wanted to know what the limo company had to say, and he wanted to know now. "Are you sure?" Dean said into the phone, and then looked at Nick and shrugged. "What?" Nick mouthed the word. Dean shook his head and closed his eyes. His head dropped and then laid his forehead against his palm. With the phone still at his ear, Dean cleared his throat and said, "Thank you." He brought both hands down to his sides, opened his eyes, and looked up at Nick. "She canceled the limo this morning." "Canceled? What?" Nick stood there dumbfounded for a minute. He'd heard the words, but he couldn't quite reconcile them in his head. If Jenny canceled the limo, that could mean only one thing. Nick had to find her, make her explain why she'd canceled the limo, and not only that, why he was starting to get the feeling that he'd been stood up at the altar. Nick's heart sank to the floor. This couldn't be real, could it? Surely not. It had to be a joke. That's what it was, a joke. And Dean was in on it. Nick tried to move, to put one foot in front of the other, but it was like his fallen heart had wrapped itself around his feet, cementing him in place. He looked at Dean. "Maybe she changed limo companies," he said, grabbing at the last fleeting straw his mind could come up with. "Maybe she did," Dean shrugged. "Still doesn't explain why she's not here." He looked at his watch. "The ceremony was scheduled to start half an hour ago." He glanced back at Nick with a look that said, "Accept it, man." Nick managed to get as far as the chair near the door. He sat, then surveyed his hands, front, then back. "I suppose I should go out there and say something." "Do you want me to do it?" Dean offered. "It's my responsibility." Nick pushed himself up from the chair. "Besides, I don't ever want to forget this moment, in case I ever think about doing something this stupid again." Nick opened the door and moved into the hallway. He wasn't sure where he'd find the sanctuary, the place where he'd have to face hundreds of people who'd come to see a wedding, and tell them there wasn't going to be one. Not today, anyway. After a few turns that got Nick nowhere, a kind lady, probably a volunteer of the church, offered to lead him and Dean to the sanctuary. She paused at the only door on the left side of a long corridor.
"It's right on the other side of this door," she smiled. "Hurry now, you don't want to be late."
She nodded and was off. You don't want to be late. That almost made Nick laugh out loud. Why should he worry about being late? Jenny hadn't had the decency to show up at all. Nick grabbed onto the cool metal doorknob and turned. Panic swarmed through him as he peered into the sanctuary, seeing hundreds of people, all their guests, waiting to witness his and Jenny's wedding. Dean gave him a gentle nudge. Nick sucked in a breath of courage and stepped through the door. Gazing out over the crowd, Nick stalled, trying to find the words. He paused a little longer on the faces of the people he knew by name, like Angela Davies. They'd worked together years ago over at Martini's, back when he was a cook and she was the hostess. They'd dated once or twice. She was married now, with 2 kids. Gary Larson, an old college buddy, looked bored beyond words. Julia Mason, his mother's longtime friend. When their eyes met, her hopeful expression turned to one of sadness. He hadn't seen that look on her face since the day his mother died nearly 10 years ago. The crowd started to stir. They were getting restless, antsy, wanting to know what was going on. Well, he'd better say something before they all turned on him. Nick cleared his throat. "Sorry to keep you waiting," was the only thing he could come up with. Too bad his mother wasn't here. She'd know what to say. His older brother, Kevin, would dazzle them with his charm, if he were here. "Let's face it, everybody's gone off and left you, boy, even Jenny." "I thank you for your time in coming out today. I'm not entirely clear about what's going on right now, but I can tell you there's not going to be a wedding. At least not today." Hushed whispers turned into louder grumbles as people began to rise from their seats and make their way toward the front door. Some paused in the aisle, looking briefly at Nick. It was as if they were thinking about coming to offer him condolences, but then deciding against it. Some shook their heads before turning away, but most simply headed for the door. Dean nudged Nick's elbow, leading him back toward the rear hallway they'd come in through. "Do you think she's at the house?" Nick asked Dean once they were in the corridor. "It's beyond me," Dean said in a kind, soothing tone. "If she didn't want to get married, why didn't she just tell you?" He squeezed Nick's shoulder lightly. "Instead of this." "I'm going to go see if she's at the house," Nick said. "Shit." He tossed his hands in the air. "My truck's at the Hang 10. Will you drop me by there?" "Of course," Dean said, with an understanding nod. "Let's go." The drive passed by mostly in silence. It wasn't until Dean rolled into the parking lot at Hang 10, where there were several cars in addition to Nick's truck, that the conversation picked up again. "Jesus," Nick swore. "I forgot about the stupid reception." "I'll take care of it," Dean said. "I'll go in and tell the staff that there won't be any reception here today, and they can all go home." "Thanks, man," Nick sighed. That was one weight lifted off his shoulders. "What about all the food?" Nick let the possibilities roll through his mind until a good one stuck. "Call St. Dom's," he said, of the local homeless shelter. "Tell them you've got a boatload of food for them." "Good idea." Finally, the hint of a smile from Dean. "They'll be eating well tonight." Nick climbed out and stood beside the car long enough to fish his keys from his pocket. Dean was already halfway to the restaurant's front door when he glanced over his shoulder. "You sure you don't want me to go to the house with you?" Nick shook his head. "No, it won't be a scene that you or anyone else I call a friend should witness." "Remember," Dean pointed at Nick, It's illegal to kill her."
He held a serious expression for a few seconds, then chuckled. He shook off the laughter, then added,
"Call me later."
He pointed at Nick again.
"If you don't, I'll come looking for you."
Nick knew what he meant. Dean had always wondered how Nick had managed to stay so strong after his brother had succumbed to drugs and his mother to cancer. Nick had often wondered that too, but each day he kept getting up and living life. He'd always been a survivor, but now the real test would come, and Nick Matthews had no idea how he was going to get through this. Nick figured the best place to start looking for Jenny was the house. She had, after all, banned him from coming around for the last week. Now he was really wondering why. He pulled into the driveway, hit the garage door opener that was clasped to the visor, and waited for the door to open. Instead of rolling on into the garage, he shifted into park, jumped out of the truck, and trotted into the house through the garage. Inside the laundry room, the washer and dryer were gone. "What the?" crossed Nick's mind as he passed through and on into the kitchen. The only appliances left in there were the stove and the dishwasher, and they belonged to the landlord. All the little knickknacks Jenny had on the counters were gone. He opened one cabinet, then two. Both were empty. He wasn't surprised to find the dining and living room stripped of everything but a few pieces of trash on the floor. Standing in the middle of the living room, he did a slow 180. Even the walls were bare. What the hell? After a quick inspection of the house, the only room that hadn't been completely emptied out was the bedroom, but there wasn't much left in there. Nick's clothes from the dresser had been dumped onto the middle of the floor. The closet doors were slid open. Only his clothes remained inside. All of Jenny's were gone. Nick thought about the few pieces of furniture he'd inherited from his mother a few years ago. Jenny hadn't wanted those hand-me-downs in the house. He was glad now that he'd stored his mother's things in the loft over the restaurant, along with all of his stuff. Jenny hadn't wanted any of it in the house. Not his Dodgers memorabilia, not his mother's collection of depression glass, and not his brother's surfing regalia. She made him go out and buy all new furnishings, and now she'd taken every single bit of it. Truth be told, he wasn't going to miss those hideous drapes that she'd hung over the windows in their bedroom. Each panel was a damn different color, brown, blue, green, and together it was ugly. The cold hard fact was that Jenny didn't have a lick of fashion sense, not when it came to home decor. Nick trudged back into the living room and parked himself on the stone bench in front of the fireplace. The only other alternative was the floor, and he really needed to sit down. A sudden coldness hit Nick at the core of his heart. Good riddance to her, and all that crap she took with her. Now Jenny's odd idiosyncrasies during the past few months, and especially the last couple of weeks, were starting to make sense. No wonder she'd wanted him out of the house last week. And to think she'd said it was because she wanted their wedding night to feel like they were real newlyweds. He sucked in a gallon of courage, enough to give him the mental strength to sustain him in case she came crawling back. Yeah, right. Nick laughed at himself for being such a fool. He tried to shake away his stupidity, although doubting that he could accomplish it. He pushed himself up to head for the garage. He was going to see Dean. Maybe he could get him to help move some of his things over from the loft above Hang 10. Nick Matthews was going to move on if it killed him. Chapter 7. Marseille, France. Julien Delaurent, briefcase in hand, puttered along the hallway toward the second-floor entry of Pacifique de Lumière. He checked his watch. 7:30 a.m. Good. He had plenty of time to get to the office if he left now. Julien? Claudette's sweet voice, the one she always used to lull people in when she wanted something, drifted up behind him. He stopped, sucked in a breath, then turned to greet his stepmother. Claudette, he smiled.
How nice to see you before I leave for work." "Oh, never mind all that, Julian." She shook her head and paused at his side. "We have to talk." "About?" "Your father." "Uh-oh, what's he done now?" Julian glanced at his watch again. "All right." He guided her toward the small salon just down the hall. "I have a few minutes to spare." They went into the room, but Claudette didn't speak until Julian closed the door. "What's Papa gotten you so excited over?" Julian asked. He could have used a more appropriate term, like angry, but why invite trouble? "He wants Lacey to come home." "Yes, I am aware of that," Julian chuckled. "Did you remind him that she's just as immovable as he is?" Claudette nodded. "He's an obstinate man, though." "Well," Julian was enjoying this far too much. "It's not as if he can cut her off." He'd learned that one from Camille. He'd have to remember to say it directly to Papa. That'd drive him nuts. "And Papa has no one to blame but himself." "You know your father well enough to know." Claudette shook her head. "He will not relent so easily." Julian agreed with an expressive nod. It'd take a lot more than Papa's inability to cut Lacey off financially to keep him from meddling in her life. "Any idea what he's planning?" "I think he's going to try to have her deported." Claudette sighed heavily. "He thinks that will force her to come home. But let's face it, if he angers her, she will do anything but." "Damn it, Papa, why must you?" Julian had a feeling that this could turn out much worse than Papa could ever imagine. "I thought he would have learned by now," Julian said, with a slow, disbelieving shake of the head. "But, as you well know, once Papa gets started, there's not much anyone can do to stop him." "I was thinking." Claudette glanced down at the floor, then slowly lifted her gaze back to meet Julian's. "More along the lines of talking to your sister. See if it's possible to stop her from making a bad situation worse." Julian moved to the door and wrapped his hand around the knob. Before opening it, he said, "I'll do my best." But how he was going to stop Lacey from overreacting was anybody's guess, since she was in America and he was here in France. Chapter 8. After spending 3 days brooding on Dean's couch, Nick decided it was time to move his things from the loft above Hang 10 over to the house. It was clear that Jenny wasn't coming back. Nick backed his truck, the bed crammed full of his mother's furniture, into the driveway and hit the garage door opener. Dean opened the passenger door but didn't get out. "Where do you want to put the stuff?" he asked. "In the garage or inside the house?" While the garage would be the easier thing to do, Nick knew full well that if he wanted help getting the furniture inside the house, he'd better do it now. "Let's take it inside. It's better not to clog up the garage." They bailed out of the truck. Nick went to the rear and dropped the tailgate. The piece closest to them was an old dresser that Nick's mother had said belonged to her mother. Well, at least Nick would have a place to store his clothes that Jenny had seen fit to dump in the middle of the bedroom floor. Dean hopped up on the tailgate and grabbed the bottom of one side. "Get that in," he said, of the one nearest Nick. Piece by piece, bit by bit, they unloaded the truck. The dresser, a matching headboard and 2 nightstands, a coffee table, and small bureau were all that would fit in Nick's truck on this trip. Nick stalled in the living room, sitting down on the coffee table, the last item they'd hauled in and deposited in the middle of the living room. "Well," Dean laughed, leaning against the wall near the front door, "a few more trips like this one and you'll have a place to eat, sleep, and watch TV," Dean said, poking fun at Nick's small short-bed truck. Nick gazed around the living room, then peered into the dining room and kitchen off to his right. Every inch of this house, even though she'd completely emptied it, reminded him of Jenny. Just looking at the place where the couch used to sit in the living room, that girly-looking, flowery couch where Jenny used to snuggle up to Nick, left a bad taste in his mouth. The memory of Ginny sitting at the dining table while he cooked, smiling up at him and waiting for him to serve her, wrapped around his chest like strapping vines with thorns, tightening and squeezing until he could hardly breathe. Dean stepped toward Nick. "You ready to go grab another load?" "I hate this house." Nick's voice was flat. "Yeah." Dean shrugged and nodded. "It's not exactly you, but then what is?" "I mean it." Nick kicked up his tone a notch on the serious meter. "I really hate this house." "You sure this isn't your anger at Ginny talking?" Nick snorted a laugh. "Probably." He glanced up at Dean. "But I still hate this house." He paused, letting that notion sink into his own thoughts. "I can't live here." His voice serrated the words. His fury at Ginny swirled with the disgust he was feeling over what she'd done to him. "She was the one who wanted to live here, not me." Heat flushed through his body. He wished Ginny would have left something behind so he could break it. He looked around for something, anything. But everything here now was his mother's belongings. He couldn't harm any of those. "I was perfectly fine and happy living over the restaurant before she invaded my life." Dean started doing that little fidgeting dance he does when he wants to say, "I told you so." Nick didn't want to hear that right now, no matter how true it might be. Dean hadn't liked Ginny from the get-go, but Nick had been too blind to see that she was a gold digger, obviously of minimal proportions. Seriously, there were tons of guys out there with access to way more money than Nick could scrounge up. So why him? "She set her sights pretty low, didn't she?" Nick laughed at himself. "I can't believe she spent 3 years with me just to get some second-rate furniture." "If it's any consolation," Dean offered, "she's a second-rate gold digger." They both knew Ginny liked to put on airs, Dean more so than Nick, but Nick was beginning to see the light. Funny thing was, the so-called second-hand furniture he'd inherited from his mother that Ginny had made him store above the restaurant was far more valuable monetarily than the furnishings she cleaned out of the house. Dean was right. Ginny sucked at gold digging. Somehow that made Nick feel better. "I'm going to move back into the loft," Nick said with a confident nod. "That place is a mess." Dean rolled his eyes. "I like messes." Dean chuckled. "That's true. You suck at this friend thing." Nick pushed himself up from the coffee table. "You know that?" "You're welcome." Dean feigned innocence, then stepped forward. "Want to load this stuff up and take it back to the loft?" Nick nodded. He had a direction now, and one he felt good about. He hadn't felt this positive in months. Everything was going to work out fine. Wasn't it? The next morning, Nick was back at work, tending to the needs of the restaurant before it opened at 11 in 2 hours. His first order of business was to check the inventory to make sure there were sufficient supplies for the weekend. He'd have to call today if he wanted deliveries by Friday afternoon. He left his office and cut through the dining room toward the kitchen. The storage room was located down a hall off to the left side. Before he got to the double doors that swung open into the kitchen, he was distracted by a knock on the front door. Nick peered through the window next to the door, seeing Dean standing there looking troubled. Without hesitation, he pulled the keys from his pocket and unlocked the door. Dean scurried inside and waited silently while Nick relocked the door. "What are you doing here?" Didn't he have a community center to run? "We need to talk." Dean was fidgeting, but it wasn't that rooster fidget he does when he's proud of himself. This time it was his coyote fidget, the one he does when he's antsy. "What's up?" Nick didn't know why, but his insides started to quiver. "It's about that check you gave me the other day for the community center, the computers, remember?" "Yeah." Nick's insides relaxed. It was just like Dean to get him all worked up over nothing. "What, did you lose it?" Dean had a hard time looking Nick in the eye. Nick didn't like that. Dean shook his head and said, "It bounced, man." "What?" Nick's mouth dropped to the floor. carrying his confidence along for the ride. "There's got to be a mistake. Did you go inside the bank?" Dean shifted from foot to foot, and then rubbed his forehead. "There's no mistake. Hang Ten's petty cash account is empty." Nick massaged his chin. "That can't be. There's never less than 20 grand in that account at any given time. If it drops below, money comes straight out of the line of credit to top it back off." Nick shook his head adamantly. "They made a mistake at the bank." "I don't know what's going on, but you better call the bank." Dean offered the check to Nick. He took it, wondering if this was another one of Dean's pranks. If this was a joke, Dean was one hell of an actor. Besides that, Dean wouldn't use something that meant so much to both of them as a vehicle to fuel his prank. Uncertainty gnawed at Nick's insides. This had to be a mistake. He headed for his office, waving at Dean to follow him. Nick wanted him to hear for himself that there'd been a mistake. That was all it was, a simple mistake. Maybe the teller was new and hadn't quite learned the system yet. Whatever, Nick would get this cleared up in a jiff. After getting the bank on the phone and explaining the situation, Nick gave the girl his petty cash account number, and then she put him on hold. Each second that passed while Nick waited jabbed at his confidence. What if Dean was right? What if there was no money in the account? But that didn't make sense. Nick had plenty of money at his disposal. Not tons, but enough for him and Hang Ten. Nick heard the click at the other end of the line. "Mr. Matthews?" When she said his name, her voice was not nearly as confident as it had been 2 minutes ago. "I'm afraid your account is overdrawn." "Overdrawn?" Nick said in a sharp tone. "Yes, sir, by $1,232.48. "That's impossible." Nick adopted a defiant tone. "When that account goes below $20,000, the bank automatically transfers funds from my line of credit to top it off." "Let me check that account." She paused. Nick could hear her typing in the background. After a moment, she said, "Can you give me that account number so I can make sure I'm looking at the right one?" "Sure." Nick fished his wallet from his back pocket and rifled through the contents until he found his list of account numbers. He rattled off the line of credit's number and waited. And waited. Finally, the girl on the other end cleared her throat. "Mr. Matthews?" "Yes?" "I'm afraid your line of credit is maxed out." "What?" Nick's voice had gone high and loud, fueled by the instant overdrive his heartbeat had gone into the second she said the words, maxed out. "Yes, sir. In fact, all of your accounts are overdrawn or maxed out, except for payroll and the account that pays the mortgage on the restaurant." The Hang Ten mortgage and the payroll accounts? Suddenly, and sadly, the clouds were beginning to clear. Jenny had access to all the accounts except those two. "How badly overdrawn am I?" Nick asked in a low, strained voice, afraid of the answer. "Give me a sec and I'll add it up." More clicking. Nick's heart thudded harder against his chest. His thoughts went fuzzy. He was almost able to grasp the notion that he might be financially ruined. The girl cleared her throat again and said, "All totaled, your accounts are overdrawn by $8,756.78. Plus, there's the $100,000 that you now owe on the line of credit." And that, no doubt, would soon start accruing interest. How in the world was Nick supposed to pay back 100 grand? He was financially ruined, and it was all Ginny's doing. "My ex-fiancée did this," he said. "Do I have any kind of recourse?" "She is a joint owner on all of your accounts but two." "We need to stop that right now." Nick struggled to hold his temper, reminding himself that his real target was Ginny, not this poor girl on the other end of the phone. "You'll need to come down to the bank to sign a form for that." "I'll do that this morning." Nick had managed to calm his tone. He needed the girl on his side. "How long do I have before the bank gets nasty about these overdrawn accounts and the maxed out credit line?" If the overdraft fees aren't taken care of in 30 days, the bank will report you to check systems and start collection proceedings. Your first payment of $2,139.24 will be due on the line of credit in approximately 35 days. Thank you. I'll be down to the bank in a bit to take my ex off the accounts. Nick hung up the phone and looked at Dean. Turns out, shock flowed like lava through Nick, hot and burning, and nothing could stop it. Ginny's a lot more devious than we've been giving her credit for being. Well, what's going on? Dean's voice was edgy, nervous. I'm in deep shit, Dean. Deep, deep shit.
Chapter 9. Deidre stomped her feet like a spoiled teenager. At 23, she and Lacey were hardly more than that, but they had to grow up sometime. Maybe just not today. Lacey chuckled to herself. Deidre's temper tantrums had always amused her. Today's was no exception, although she wasn't about to give in to Deidre's whims. Not this time.
Let's find a new place to hang out, Lacey insisted. Hangten can't be the only cool place on the California coast. But I liked their blackened tilapia and their lemon drop martinis.
Deidre's tone went nasal. She leaned against the fireplace mantel and stared at Lacey, who was sitting on the couch with her eyes focused on her laptop.
I'm sure Hangten doesn't have the market cornered on lemon drop martinis.
Lacey rolled her eyes back to the computer screen for a second, then let her gaze drift back up to her friend. Deidre pushed off the fireplace.
Are you farming again? No.
Lacey closed the laptop.
I'm not farming.
You are too. Deidre moved to the couch and plopped down beside Lacey.
Let's go out, she urged. Interact with the real world.
The real world sucks. Lacey put the laptop on the coffee table. Deidre laughed. Says the girl who owns this beautiful house, outright I might add, here in the land of fun.
Fun is overrated. You shouldn't get attached to it. Spoil sport.
Look, Lacey cut her eyes at Deidre.
There's always somebody who will, knowingly or not, stomp on your fun. Say, people who get married, for instance.
While it's true no decent, self-respecting girl wanted to moon over a married man, and Lacey probably would, whether she was in California or France, that wasn't what she was talking about.
I was speaking of Papa.
Lacey rolled her eyes away from Deidre.
You cannot count on any measure of fun to last while my father's around lurking in the shadows.
If Papa was set on Lacey returning home, then she had better be vigilant. With a man like him gunning for her, she didn't need the distractions that came along with having a crush on a married man. Inside Hangten, the staff moved back and forth between the kitchen, dining, and supply rooms and the outdoor patio in preparation for the lunch crowd that would begin to mill in once the doors opened at 11. Dean glanced stealthily around the dining room, then leaned across the table toward Nick.
So, what are you going to do?
They both knew what he was talking about. Nick laughed. Not a jovial laugh, but one of irony.
I owe the bank $108,000.
He shrugged.
And some change. I'd kill myself if it weren't for the insurance. The insurance? Jenny's my beneficiary.
Dean kicked his head back.
You should change that.
It's on my to-do list. Nick cut his eyes toward Dean and gave him a hard stare. Right behind trying to fend off bankruptcy.
Don't you have any money in savings?
Had. Nick corrected him.
The key word here is had. She wiped out your savings account too?
Dean shook his head.
Man, that's tough. What did you have in there? $100,000?
About $70,000. A sadness had invaded Nick's voice. It's all I had left of the money Walter left me. Walter Moreland. To hear Nick's mother tell it, Walter was just an old friend. And while Nick's father had died when Nick was about to turn 11, the best he could ever recall, Walter Moreland was not a person that his father had ever spoke of.
But the way Nick saw it, considering that Nick had been named in Walter's will, something had gone on between his mother and Walter, hopefully before she married his father.
Seriously?
Dean's tone turned gruff right along with his frown.
She wiped out your inheritance, too. Is that legal?
Apparently the only person in this scenario who committed a crime was me, for being so damn stupid. Nick flushed hot with an abrupt and vicious indignation. I added her to my accounts, gave her carte blanche to rob me blind.
You can't beat yourself up about that.
Why not? Nick's scoffing laughter had a bite to it. I'm responsible for my own undoing.
Hell, Nick, you were going to marry the girl. That's what married people do. They share bank accounts and crap like that.
Well, let that be a lesson to you. Nick's tone was unwavering. He hoped he'd never forget the lesson being taught to him now. Steer clear of marriage, man, and never ever give someone access to your bank accounts.
You've learned what not to do.
Dean gave him one of those nods, like he knew the conversation had taken a wrong turn somewhere along the way. He shrugged and said,
Question is, what are you going to do now?
I don't know. Nick shook his head. Maybe I can get some credit with the suppliers for the next few months. If I don't have to pay them, maybe I can make a dent in the money I owe the bank and still keep the community center afloat. The community center. It had been an unmentioned topic hanging in the air between them ever since Nick found out what Jenny had done to his bank accounts. Simple truth was, Nick wasn't the only one in trouble here. If he lost his financial footing, the community center would suffer too. Without him, the center would fade away. And if Nick let that happen, it'd be like letting his brother down all over again. Chapter 10. Marseille, France. In the bedroom suite at Pacifique de Lumière, Camille Delaurent's husband, Julien, lingered at her side while she perused the jewelry in the box near the dresser. "Chérie, are you bored with these gems?" he asked. "Try the safe downstairs. I'm sure you'll find something to your liking in there." The safe downstairs was a room that easily rivaled the size of any of the stores on Rodeo Drive. It was the Delaurent's basement, and it housed the family jewels, unlike the personal items here in Camille's jewelry chest. These were hers. The stuff down there belonged to the family, but she supposed that one day most of the jewels down there would be hers. Sort of.
No,
she laughed playfully.
I'm just procrastinating about what to wear.
Whatever you wear, he said, it will pale in comparison to your beauty. His lips brushed temptingly against her cheek. A blush heated her face for just a split second before she caught it and wrangled it in.
Julien Delaurent.
She looked at his reflection in the mirror and said, "You're up to something." "Me?" His hand flew to his chest. "Yes, you," she nodded.
"The question is, what could you possibly be trying to flatter out of me?"
"Chérie, how can you suspect me of ulterior motives?" He laid it on thick. Between his velvety smooth voice, sparkling eyes, and hint of a smile, a girl could get talked out of her good graces. But Julien had already done that. No, he wanted something else from her, and Camille wanted to cut to the chase to find out what.
"Spill it."
"I just thought you might like to vacation in California for a while," he said in a more serious tone. A pang of longing shot through Camille and wafted out in her voice.
"California."
"Perhaps Tasha could go with you?" An even better idea. "Maybe we could stay at Lacey's." She nodded. Julien grinned, and in that instant Camille knew she'd stumbled upon his motive.
"Ah, I see."
"I think it might be best if you and Tasha go with Gerard. I think your presence will make it easier for her to accept a butler in the house." Julien stopped and laughed softly. "One she'll undoubtedly think is Papa's spy."
"And just how long is a while?"
Caution had invaded her voice. "Some weeks," he shrugged. "However long it takes." Some weeks? However long it takes? Why so long? It's not like Lacey was socially inept. Camille crossed her arms at her waist and peered at Julian through narrowed eyes. And what else should I be doing while I'm there? Julian laughed and waved a surrendering motion at Camille before taking her hand and tugging her toward the chairs by the window. Well, he waited for her to sit before he did. Now that Lacey knows how far Papa is willing to go to bring her home, she's bound to retaliate. Would he really have her deported? That was low, even for Maurice. Julian looked at her and grinned. In a New York minute. She's not going to like that. No, she's not. Julian paused, and Camille could feel his eyes on her. She shifted her gaze toward him. That's where you come in. Me? She asked with a curious innocence. And Tasha, Julian added. Camille squinted her eyes. I'm not going to talk the girl into coming home, she said, shaking her head. And I highly doubt that Tasha will either. I don't want you to talk her into coming home. Then what do you want us to do?